Zero survivors. That is the only statistic that matters when the smoke clears over the gray waters of the Baltic Sea. We are not talking about a merchant fleet lost in a storm. We are talking about 60 Swedish warships, the most feared military machine in history, reduced to splintered wood and floating corpses in less than an hour. The Vikings, the alpha predators of Europe, the men who sacked Paris and besieged Constantinople, did not die here fighting an empire or a Christian king. They died screaming in terror at something they could not comprehend until it was too late. History books have lied to us. They sold us the image of the invincible Viking, the wolf hunting sheep. But on the eastern shores, in the dense forests of what we now call Estonia and Latvia, the wolves met bears, tribes that not only did not fear the Norse, but learned to hunt them. The Curonians, the Oecilians, names that mean nothing today, but in the 11th century made the kings of Sweden and Denmark wake up sweating in the middle of the night. To understand the absolute panic that broke out that morning, you have to understand the arrogance that preceded it. For 300 the Baltic Sea was a Swedish lake. The kings of Spaland looked east and saw only one thing, a warehouse of slaves. They crossed the sea. It was easy. It was routine. It was business. But they made the fatal mistake of any declining empire. They underestimated their victims' capacity to learn. No one noticed the change. At first, it was subtle. A Viking ship that did not return. A Danish patrol that vanished without trace near the island of Sara. The Hars in Sigtuna, Sweden's commercial capital, attributed it to bad weather or bad luck. They did not want to see the truth. They did not want to admit that on the other side of the sea, in hidden shipyards among the fjords of Coronia, the barbarians were building their own ships. And they were not cheap copies. They were lighter, flat-bottomed vessels designed not to cross oceans, but to move like ghosts through shallow waters and rocky archipelagos where the heavy Swedish drakers ran ground. The blindness ended on a summer Tuesday. The lookout in the fortress on the island of Gotland did not sound the alarm horn because what he saw on the horizon made no sense. They were not red and white striped square sails. The Norse distinctive was dark sails. They did not come in battle formation. They came in a chaotic swarm, fast cutting the waves with a violence that paralyzed the garrison. They were the Oilians, and they did not come to trade. The Battle of Gotland was not a battle, it was an execution. The Baltic raiders did not seek honorable man-to-man combat. That is a luxury for those who believe they will live forever. They used naval guerrilla tactics, throwing iron hooks against the gunwales of the anchored Swedish ships. But instead of boarding, they threw pitched torches and ships was total. Men who had killed Saxons and Franks without blinking now jumped into the water in full armor, choosing to drown rather than face the demons emerging from the smoke. But the real horror was not in death, but in what came after. The Vikings feared death without sword in hand, because it meant losing Valhalla, but they feared the Kyrenians more for what they did with the living. Legends spoke of shrines in the deep forests of Kyonia, where Norse prisoners were not enslaved, but sacrificed. Baltic priests read the future in the entrails of Swedish warriors. That certainty knowing your final fate was not a glorious grave, but a blood-stained stone altar in a foreign forest broke Viking morale faster than any sword. In Sigtuna, news of the disaster at Gotland arrived 2 days later. The fishermen found the fleet remnants washed up on the beach, bodies beheaded and impaled in the sand with ash spears. The message was clear. The Baltic no longer belonged to them. King Knut Eriksson, locked in his fortress, faced an existential crisis. If he could not protect his own coasts, his authority would crumble. Rival clans would smell weakness. He needed a quick victory. He needed to crush these eastern pirates to restore the natural order of things. So he made the decision that would seal the fate of thousands. Instead of fortifying the coast, he ordered the gathering of the remaining royal fleet, the ladang, and launched it in a full offensive to the east. They were going to burn Coronia to the ground. They were going to teach them a lesson. It was a massive mobilization. 300 ships, 10,000 men. Steel gleamed under the July sun as the ships sailed from the Stockholm archipelago. Priests blessed the sails. Wives waved from the docks. It looked like a triumphant march. It looked like the return of the old days of glory. But there was a problem, a tiny detail that the king and his generals overlooked in their arrogance. Spies. Sigtuna was an international trading city. Russians, Germans, Wends, and Bolts walked its streets, selling furs and wax. Among the merchants who smiled and paid their taxes to the Swedish king were eyes that watched every move. There were men who memorized the number of ships, the amount of provisions, and above all the exact departure date. While the Swedish fleet sailed east, seeking a fight in open sea, a solitary, small, and fast ship left Sigtuna in the opposite direction, hugging the coast southward, carrying a message to the warlords of Coronia. The message was simple: the nest is empty, the she-wolf has left her cubs alone, the Swedish fleet sailed into a trap. Yes, but not the trap they imagined. They expected to find resistance on the beaches of Coronia. They expected a when the raiders met their match shield wall. What they found was nothing. Coastal villages were deserted, livestock had vanished, wells were poisoned. It was a ghost land. Confused Swedish generals ordered landing and penetration into the forest to seek the enemy. That was the exact moment the war changed forever. While 10,000 Vikings marched heavily through the trees, seeking an enemy that vanished like mist. 300 km away across the sea, a massive fleet of black sails emerged from the morning fog off the Swedish archipelago. They were not going to fight the army. They were going for the heart. They were going for Sigtuna in the city. The jewel of the Swedish crown was defended by old men and children. Dawn on Lake Muren was usually silent, a white mist floating over the still water, broken only by the occasional leap of a fish. But that morning, the mist was not broken by nature. It was broken by the sound of 1,000 oars striking the water in unison. For the inhabitants of Sigtuna, the stone city, the commercial and religious heart of Sweden, hell did not wait for the sun to rise. It arrived with the first light. The wooden barriers protecting the harbor entrance, designed to stop heavy drawers, were useless. The shallow draft Curonian and Oilian ships simply slid over the submerged obstacles like snakes crossing fallen branches. There was no negotiation, no cries of surrender, only fire. The city guard, composed of veteran elders and youths who had not yet seen their first winter at sea, ran to the walls. What they saw froze their blood. It was not a disciplined army forming shield lines. It was a tide. Baltic warriors disembarked, running, leaping from the prows before the ships touched sand. They did not wear the heavy chain mail of the Norse that slows movement. They wore hardened leather and short axes. They were fast, brutally fast. In less than 15 minutes, the main gate of Sigtuna was in flames. Meanwhile, 400 kilometers to the east in the dense forests of Coronia, King Kut Eriksson began to sense that something was terribly wrong. His army of 10,000 men had been marching in circles for days. Local guides they had captured and tortured for information had led them into swamps where horses broke legs and armored men sank waist-deep in black mud. The enemy did not appear, and that was worse than seeing them. Every night, 3 or 4 Swedish sentinels vanished. No scream was heard. They only found their helmets dented on the moss the next morning. Psychological warfare was dismantling the discipline of the most powerful military force in the north. The captains began arguing among themselves. Where are their cities? Where is their gold? The answer was the silence of the forest. The Kionians did not defend territory, they defended time. Every day the Swedes spent, there was a day Sigtuna burned unprotected. Back in the Swedish city, the massacre had reached the cathedral. Archbishop Johannes, the most sacred figure of Christianity in Sweden, took refuge at the main altar, surrounded by terrified women and children. They believed the church walls would protect them. They believed even barbarians would respect the house of God. They were wrong. The Oilians did not come for gold, though they took it. They came to send a political message. They battered down the cathedral's oak doors with improvised rams. The sound of splintering wood echoed like a gunshot in the central nave. When the invaders entered, they did not stop before the cross. Archbishop Johannes was decapitated right there on the altar steps. His blood stained the sacred ornaments. In an act of supreme humiliation, the invaders not only stole the church treasure, they dismantled the magnificent bronze doors of the city, masterpieces of Swedish craftsmanship, and loaded them onto their ships. They took not just metal, they took Sweden's pride. Sigtuna, the city smoke was so dense it is said to have darkened the sun on farms 20 km away. Survivors who fled to the forests looked back and watched their world collapse. The Pact Sudica, the peace imposed by Viking power, had ended. The hunters had become prey. Across the sea, King Kenneth finally decided to retreat. Lack of supplies and impossible terrain had defeated his army without a single pitched battle. Back to the ships, he ordered, frustrated, spitting on the ground. We will return next summer and burn this cursed forest. But when the Swedish vanguard reached the beach where they had left their fleet, the king's heart stopped. The ships were there, yes, but not as they had left them. Of the 300 anchored ships, 50 were burning. A fast Coronian raiding force hidden in nearby coves had waited for the main army to penetrate the forest before attacking the rear guard. The guards left watching the ships lay dead on the shore with black arrows in their throats. Chaos seized the beach. The Swedes, exhausted, hungry, and now partially trapped on enemy land, looked to the horizon and then saw it. It was not a rescue ship. It was a small Swedish fishing boat with torn sails that had miraculously crossed the sea, fast driven by terror. The messenger on board fell at the king's feet, breathless face smeared with soot. Kenneth grabbed him by the tunic and lifted him. "What is it? Speak. The archbishop is dead. They have taken the doors." The silence that followed was heavier than any shield. The king released the messenger. Around him, 10-0. 0-0 hardened warriors lowered their gazes. They had not been defeated by a superior force. They had been outwitted. They had left their house door open, and the wolf had entered and devoured their children. But the humiliation was not over. The journey back across the Baltic would not be a stroll. The Kionians knew the Swedes would return, desperate, wounded, and morale shattered. And the sea, that vast gray desert, is the worst place to be afraid, because at sea there is nowhere to hide. The return journey was not a retreat, it was a hunt. The Baltic has a cruel peculiarity. It is full of islands, islets, and hidden sandbanks. For an expert navigator, it is a playground. For a demoralized fleet with tired captains and lookouts whose eyes burned from lack of sleep, it is a deadly maze. King Kun knew the Oilians would not settle for burning his capital. They wanted the serpent's head. They wanted to sink the royal fleet to ensure Sweden could not raise a sword against them for a generation. The trap closed near the island of Gotland. The Swedish fleet, now reduced to 250 ships, sailed in tight formation like a herd of musk oxmen protecting themselves from wolves. But the sea allows no shield walls. Fog rose in mid-afternoon and revealed the nightmare. They were not alone. Small, fast ships painted gray and blue to blend with the water appeared on the flanks. They did not attack head-on. The bolts had studied Viking naval warfare, and knew boarding a draw full of heavy warriors was suicide. So they did something new, something cowardly in Norse eyes, but brilliant in history's. They used speed and fire. Curonian ships buzzed close to the heavy Swedish transports, so close they could see the painted faces of their rowers, and launched clay pots full of boiling fat and burning pitch. They did not seek to kill the crew, they sought the sails. In minutes, panic seized the Swedish formation. A ship without sails is a floating coffin. Fire at sea is the sailor's most primal fear. There is nowhere to run. You only choose between burning or drowning. The ship of Beowulf, one of Uppsala's most feared veterans, was the first to break formation. He tried to turn to ram his attackers, but his ship was too slow. The agile Estonian boats circled around it, peppering Swedish rowers with the tribe the Vikings refused to name short spears. The great drawer drifted, spinning uselessly, while its attackers dismantled it piece by piece, methodically, without risking a single man in boarding. King Coote watched from his flagship powerless. If he stopped to help, the entire fleet would be surrounded. He had to make the coldest decision of his life: keep sailing, let the lagging and wounded ships be devoured to save the rest. The cries of his own men begging for help faded into the fog behind him, silenced by the roar of flames and the sea. When the Swedish coast finally appeared on the horizon 2 days later, there were no cheers. The smell arrived first, an acrid, heavy odor of burned wood and rotting flesh carried by the wind from the shore. Entering Sigtuna Bay, the hardened warriors wept, not from sadness, but from impotent rage. The city was not simply damaged. It was gutted. The wooden docks, where they had played as children, were floating charcoal. The merchants' houses empty. And the silence was absolute. Kenneth disembarked on an ash-covered gray beach. His boots raised clouds of black dust with every step. He walked toward the ruins of the stone cathedral, where there had once been bronze doors and chants. Now there was only darkness and flies. In the center of the market square, survivors who had come down from the forests gathered around their king. They were dirty, hungry, and looked at their monarch not with reverence but with doubt. A king who cannot protect his home is not a king. He is just a man with an expensive hat. Connaught removed his helmet and let it fall to the ground. The metallic sound echoed in the dead square. He knew this was not the end of the war. He knew the Chionians and Oilians now smelled blood in the water. They had shown the world that the Norse giant had feet of clay. But while Sweden licked its wounds across the Baltic, the victory had an unexpected effect. The tribes were not sated with Sigtuna's plunder. On the contrary, success gave them voracious hunger. They realized that united they were unstoppable, and then they made the classic mistake of victors over ambition. They did not settle for dominating the sea. They looked south toward a different enemy, toward a force that did not fight for gold or land, but for something far more dangerous: God. The knights of the Livonian Order of the Sword Brothers were watching, and unlike the Swedes, they did not underestimate anyone. While Sigtuna burned in the stone fortresses of Germany, a response was being forged. Crusade was about to begin, and it would bring a terror that would make Viking raids seem like children's games. While the north licked its wounds and Sweden sank into mourning in the south, the true monster was awakening. The Chionians and Oilians' mistake was believing all white men from the west were the same. They thought that by humiliating the Vikings they had defeated Europe. They did not understand that the Vikings were deep down glorified bandits. They fought for loot, pride, families. They were chaotic. But the enemy, now fixing its eyes on the Baltic coasts, did not seek gold, did not seek slaves, and most terrifying of all, had no fear of death because they believed they held the key to paradise. Rome had spoken. Pope Innocent Roman IV was not interested in tribal skirmishes. He declared a crusade, but not toward Jerusalem, toward the north, toward Europe's last pagans. And the spearhead of this invasion was not farmers with axes. It was the Livonian sword brothers, warrior monks. Men who had renounced families, lands, and names to become consecrated killing machines. They arrived at the mouth of the Daugava River, not to sack and leave like the Danes did. They arrived to stay. The cultural clash was immediate and brutal. When tribal scouts saw the German ships arriving, they laughed. They were heavy, slow, loaded with stone and wood. Floating tombs they called them. The local warriors, drunk on their victory over Sweden, decided to apply the same tactic, quick ambush fire, and withdraw. But when they launched their first attack against the settlement that would later be called Ria, they encountered something they had never seen. The Germans did not form a shield wall and wait shouting insults. They locked themselves in, and not behind wooden palisades that rot and burn. They raised stone walls. Stone was alien technology to the forest tribes. Their arrows bounced uselessly off the gray masonry. Their axes dented, and from the top of those walls, death ringed with mechanical precision. The crossbow appeared. A Viking bow requires years of training to be lethal. A warrior is born, not made. But a crossbow allows a recruited peasant to pierce the chest of the best tribal warrior from 100 paces by simply pulling a lever. The first time the Curonians tried to assault Ria's construction works, they did not hear war cries. They heard the dry buzz of bolts flying and the wet sound of flesh tearing. Hundreds died without even seeing their killer faces. But the real terror came in open field. Bishop Albert of Ria knew he could not hide behind walls forever. He had to project power. He had to show these barbarians that his god was stronger than the forest spirits. So he deployed the sword brothers. Imagine the scene. A few thousand tribal warriors, light-fast, dressed in furs and leather, armed with spears and short swords. They were used to the dance of war, want and T and HONEHOS, TEST answer, to DECIDED, your SEVENY, argument to dodging, and facing them a line of steel statues, riders on giant war horses, covered in metal mesh from head to hoof. There was no tactic, it was pure physics, mass times velocity. When the German heavy cavalry charged, the ground literally trembled. Chronicles say the sound was like thunder rolling across the earth. The Baltic warriors tried to stand firm through their javelins, but these bounced off the knight's plate and mail like hail on a roof. The impact was devastating. The cavalry charge did not break the tribal line, it pulverized it. 600 kiosk horses trained to bite and kick crushed bodies under their hooves. The knights' long lances skewered 2 or 3 men at a time. It was not a fight, it was a harvest. The Curonians, the same men who had made Swedish kings flee, panicked. Their speed was useless if they could not get close to strike. Their ferocity was worthless against a moving wall of iron. That day, on the muddy plains near the Daugava, the myth of Baltic invincibility broke. Survivors fled to the swamps, leaving thousands of corpses behind. But the worst was not the defeat. It was what they saw afterward. The sword brothers did not celebrate, did not drink, did not loot bodies for gold. They simply cleaned their swords, said a short prayer, and reformed ranks in absolute silence. That inhuman discipline terrified the tribal chiefs more than any torture. Like fighting men who feel neither pleasure nor anger, who only fulfill a divine function, yet humans are adaptable. In the Baltic tribes had not survived 1,000 years in those harsh forests by surrendering to the first winter. In the depths of Lithuania's and Semigalia's forests, a war council was convened. Old shamans and young warlords understood that the old way of fighting had died. If they wanted to survive the Iron Crusade, they had to evolve, had to stop being scattered tribes, and become something more. They had to unite and needed to decipher the enemy's technology. If stone and iron were God's weapons, then they would have to steal those weapons from God. The resistance was about to change tactics. They would no longer seek suicidal pitched battles. They would take the war where heavy horses could not enter, to the ice. Winter was approaching, and the Baltic winter forgives no one, not even men of iron. 30 degrees below zero. At that temperature, metal is not protection, it is torture. The steel of armor cools so much that touching your own sword without gloves sticks skin and tears it when pulling away. Breath freezes on helmet grills, creating an ice mask that suffocates. Terror beyond the battlefield, but the sword brothers marched. It was February 1236. The Grand Master of the Order, a man named Viking, made the classic mistake of one who believes technology trumps nature. He looked at maps and saw that the dense forests and swamps that stopped his cavalry in summer were now frozen. Ice highways, he thought, solid rivers, his war horses could gallop along without obstacles to strike the heart of pagan lands. While they slept, Volwin gathered a massive column, Teutonic knights, Russian auxiliaries, German mercenaries, a 2 km long serpent of iron gleaming under the pale winter sun. They penetrated Semigallian territory, confident laughing, burning some isolated farms to warm themselves. They did not know they were being herded. Lithuanian and Semigallian scouts wore no plate armor. They wore wolf furs and wooden skis. They moved silently through the forest, invisible against the snow, communicating with bird whistles. They did not attack the main column. They simply watched. Let the Germans penetrate deeper and deeper farther from their fortresses. Letting cold and fatigue bite, they waited until the column reached the Saw Pass, a deceptive terrain of vast clearing, covered in virgin snow that seemed firm ground, but hid a boggy swamp under a brittle ice crust. The trap closed at dusk. The German vanguard stopped dead. Before them, blocking the only valley exit, it appeared a line of warriors. They were not many, they seemed easy prey. Vulen, impatient and eager to finish quickly to set camp, ordered the charge. "Crush them," he shouted. "God wills it." 500 knights lowered lances and spurred their mounts. The earth thundered. The heaviest cavalry charge of the Middle Ages. The most unstoppable force launched forward. They gained speed. Impact seemed imminent, and then physics did its work. When the 600-kiloed horses charging men in 40 kilos of steel hit the frozen bog zone, the ice cracked. It did not break completely, but it gave enough. Horses' legs punched through the hard crust and sank into the frozen, sticky mud below. The charger's momentum stopped dead. Horses stumbled, rolled, broke legs. Knights were thrown falling like overturned turtles in deep snow. Chaos was instant, and then the signal. From the flanking forests, thousands of tribal warriors surged running. They did not trudge painfully through snow. They slid on snowshoes, fast, agile. They pounced on the trapped knights in the mud. A knight on the ground as a tank without tracks. Useless, they used hooks to drag riders into the swamp's icy water and let the weight of their own armor drown them. Grandmaster Vulcan fought like a demon. Surrounded with his horse dead, he swung his sword in a circle of death. But this was not a tournament. There was no honor. A Semigallian warrior slid behind and slashed his knee tendons with a sickle. The iron giant fell to his knees, screaming, not from pain, but from fury. Before he could rise, a dozen spears pinned him to the ground. The massacre at Saul lasted less than an hour. Nearly 50 high-ranking knights, the Order's elite, died there along with 2,000 FD soldiers. It was total annihilation. The Livonian Order of the Sword Brothers, the military organization that had terrorized the Baltic for 3 decades, was decapitated in a single afternoon. But the victory brought something more dangerous than celebration. It brought political unity among the victors. A man watched the field of corpses with cold, calculating eyes. His name was Mandalgus. He was not a simple tribal chief content with stealing horses and going home. He saw what they had just done. They had defeated the greatest military power of the West and understood that if they wanted to survive the inevitable revenge, old customs had to die. That night under torchlight, while his men stripped the dead of valuable chain mailers, began weaving his own web. "Look at this," he told the other chiefs, pointing at the German bodies. "They bleed like us. They dive cold like us. But they will return and next time bring more. If we remain separate tribes, they will hunt us one by one. If we are a fist, we are untouchable. Fear is a great motivator, but ambition is better." Menailers did not offer just survival. He offered an empire. In the following months, this warlord began a brutal unification campaign. Chiefs who joined him got gold and power. Those who refused he killed. No middle ground. He was building the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the only pagan state able to look Christianity in the eye and not blink. But in Rome and the Teutonic Order's fortresses in Prussia, news of the Saul disaster did not provoke fear. It provoked industrial mobilization. Pope Gregory IX, upon learning of Volwin's death, did something radical. He dissolved the remnants of the Sword Brothers and merged them with the largest and most terrible war machine in existence, the Teutonic Order. It was no longer a local crusade, now it was total war. The Teutons brought engineered siege catapults and renewed fanaticism, and they had a new target. They knew they could not easily conquer Lithuanian forests, so they decided to cut their air. They decided to go for their commercial ally, their gate to the east. They decided to attack the Republic of Novgorod. They decided to challenge Prince Alexander Nevsky. They were going to try crossing the ice once more because arrogance is the only disease that kills you, resurrects you, and kills you the same way again. Year 1242, the Teutonic Order did not make mistakes, or so they believed. After absorbing the remnants of the defeated Sword Brothers, they launched eastward with renewed machinery. They were no longer interested in scattered forest tribes. They wanted the Russian bear's head. They wanted the Republic of Novgorod. For the German knights, Orthodox Russians were little more than schismatic heretics, barely a step above pagans. They conquered with insulting ease. The city fell, its leaders chained, and the Black Cross banner raised on the walls. The road to Novgorod was open. It seemed a military stroll, but Novgorod had a protector, a 20-year-old prince named Alexander. History would know him as Nevsky. Alexander was not a mystic or fanatic. He was a pragmatist. He knew mathematics. He knew his light infantry and citizen militias would be minced meat, facing the Teutonic heavy cavalry charge on firm ground. A Teutonic knight on his warhorse is a 1-ton projectile. You do not stop it with wooden shields. You step aside or die. So Alexander did the unthinkable. He did not defend his city's walls. He went out to meet them. He led his army to the most desolate and dangerous place possible, the frozen surface of Lake Pappas. It was April 5th. Spring was beginning to awaken, and the ice, though thick, was treacherous. The locals called it crow ice because it seemed solid, but could swallow a man in a blink if you did not know the way. The Teutonic generals saw the Russian army formed on the lake and smiled under their helmets. They offer us battle in open field on a flat surface ideal for charging. God has delivered them on a platter. They ordered the classic formation, the bore snout a steel wedge. The heaviest and best armed knights at the tip, and flanks protecting infantry in the center. The purpose of this formation is simple. Strike the enemy line center with unstoppable brute force, split the rival army in two, and then massacre the disorganized remnants. It is a hammer designed to crack nuts, and Alexander gave them exactly the nut they wanted to crack. He placed his weakest troops, city militia armed with old spears and axes, right in the center. On the flanks, he hid his elite cavalry and best archers. It was an invitation to suicide. He was offering his army's heart as bait. The Teutonic charge began. The sound was deafening, hundreds of iron shot hooves striking the ice in unison, creating a roar that echoed on the lake shores like a giant war drum. The German wedge gained speed. They impacted the Russian center with terrible violence. The Russian line bent. Novgorod militiamen died by dozens, crushed and skewered. They retreated, screaming, breaking ranks. The Teutonic knights, drunk on imminent victory, pushed harder, penetrating deep into the enemy mass. "They are broken," they shouted. "Pursue them." They fell into the trap with both feet. By pushing the center, the Teutons were surrounded on three sides without realizing. And then Alexander gave the signal. From the flanks the Germans had ignored. The wings of the Russian army emerged. Novgorod cavalry, equipped with lighter horses and flexible armor, closed the pinces. Horse archers began shooting not at the knights, but at their mounts. The boar snout formation stopped. The knights, packed against each other, could not turn their huge horses. They were stuck in a confused mass of metal and flesh. Mobility, their greatest advantage, was gone. And then what Alexander had coldly calculated from the start happened. The lake protested. The ice, repeatedly struck by thousands of men and horses, concentrated in one spot, began to groan. Dark cracks like black lightning started running under the Teutonic horses' hooves. The weight of German arrogance was literal. Their armor was too heavy for the silence after April ice, weakened by combat. Real panic began when the first knight vanished under black water. The sound of breaking ice is something no one who has heard it forgets. It is not a dry crack like a branch. It is a deep grave moan, as if a gigantic beast's belly was tearing. For the Teutonic knights trapped in the center of Lake Papers, that sound was the final sentence. Imagine absolute terror. Men trained to withstand sword cuts, to ignore arrow pain, suddenly facing an enemy you cannot fight. Physics full plate in mail armor weighs 20 to 30 kilo. Wet with soaked padding more. On firm ground, it makes you a tank. In water, it makes you an anchor. When the surface gave way, it was not a heroic fall. It was chaos of black water and icy foam. Maddened horses from thermal shock kicked frantically, breaking their own riders' skulls in desperate attempts to stay afloat. Knights who fell into the water had no chance to swim. They sank like stones, dragged to the lake bottom, screaming air bubbles in closed helmets until icy water filled their lungs. For those who stayed on solid ice fragments, the situation was no better. The boar snout was shattered. Panic is contagious, seeing their brothers vanish into the black abyss. The Teutonic rear guard turned to flee. But ice is treacherous. War horses slipped, trying to turn, falling sideways, trapping riders' legs under their bellies. And then the Russian hunters attacked. Alexander Nevsky's light cavalry, mounted on small, agile horses, accustomed to winter terrain, pursued the Germans in retreat for 7 kilometers across the frozen lake. It was not a battle, it was a rabbit hunt. Russian hooks pulled down great masters and daggers found armor gaps in armpits and necks. The lake's white snow turned bright red of violent contrast visible from the shores. By day's end, the Teutonic Order's elite had been annihilated or captured. 50 brother knights, Europe's warrior nobility, died as many were led to scoff chained, walking barefoot beside their captured horses for greater humiliation. The battle on the ice did more than save Novgorod. It drew a line in blood and on the map that would last centuries. Alexander Nevsky sent a clear message to the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. The East was closed. Catholic expansion had crashed against a wall of ice and Orthodox faith. The Drangnaken, the German push eastward stopped dead. But while the two giants, Russia and the Teutonic Order, bled each other on the ice, someone else watched from the shadows of the central forests. Someone who had learned the most important lesson of all. Mindaugas, Lithuania's unifier, saw his two greatest enemies weaken. He understood that the power vacuum left by the Teutonic defeat was his golden opportunity. It was no longer enough to be a confederation of annoying pagan tribes. It was time to become a legitimate power. If Viking brute force had failed, and Crusader technological force had failed, then the answer was politics. Mindaugas did something that stunned both allies and enemies. He sent emissaries to the Pope. "I will accept your crown," said the pagan king. "I will accept your baptism, but on my terms." It was a master stroke of geopolitical chess. By converting to Christianity, even if only nominally and for political convenience, Mandaugas removed the Teutonic Orde's main excuse for war. They could no longer launch a crusade against a Christian king anointed by the Pope. He disabled the German war machine with a diplomatic letter, something 1,000 swords had not achieved. In 1253, Mandaugas was crowned King of Lithuania, the first and only king. The tribes that once ran half-naked through forests, feared by Vikings and hunted by Germans, were now a kingdom recognized by Rome. But peace is an illusion in the Baltic. Mandaugas' conversion enraged pagan traditionalists in his own court in the Teutonic Order. Feeling cheated and purposeless began conspiring. The truce was not the end of war. It was just time to sharpen knives again. Were not civilized, they became the largest empire Europe had seen in centuries. The final fusion between pagan ferocity and political cunning was about to create the Grand Duchy, a beast that would devour everything from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And it all began because a group of arrogant Vikings underestimated the men who lived among the trees. Peace is fragile when signed with ink, but indestructible when forged with betrayal. King Mindaugas had bought time with his baptism. But in the forests of Samojisha, the old gods had not died. The hardest clans, those who never accepted the cross, looked at their king with contempt. For them, diplomacy was weakness, and the Teutonic Order, humiliated but not destroyed, made the final mistake. They believed one man's conversion meant a people's submission. They believed the Sionians and Estonians, now technically allies and forcibly recruited into Christian ranks, were loyal. On July 13, 1260, the lie exploded in the Battle of Derb. The Teutonic Order gathered the largest army ever seen in the Baltic to crush the Samojitian rebels. It was an extermination force, hundreds of knights, thousands of foot soldiers, and crucially contingents of forced Curonians and Estonians to fight for their oppressors. When the armies clashed near Lake Dor, the unthinkable happened. In the midst of combat, when the Teutonic knights ordered the attack, the Kyrenians lowered their spears, but not toward the enemy they turned. They looked at the Germans, who had enslaved them, taken their lands and gods, and smiled. It was the most devastating backstab of the Middle Ages. The Allies attacked the knights from inside their own formation. Chaos was absolute. The Teutons found themselves fighting for their lives against rebels in front, and their own auxiliaries in the rear. 150 brother knights died that day. The order's marshal fell. The banner of the Virgin Mary was trampled in mud, mixed with blood. News of the Derby disaster reached Mandaugas' court like thunder, and the king, the political fox, saw the sign. He tore the cross from his neck, expelled. The priests burned the churches he had ordered built. "The experiment is over," he declared. Lithuania would not be a vassal of Rome. Lithuania would be a pagan empire. The Iron Wall had fallen. The Teutonic defeat at Derbis sparked the Great Prussian Uprising. For 14 years, the Baltic burned in a war of liberation that erased decades of Crusader conquests. Castles burned, garrisons vanished, and from the ashes of this endless violence emerged the final truth. The Vikings had been right to fear. Those men who began defending their beaches with stolen ships and guerrilla tactics now ruled a superpower. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania did not stop in the forests. In the following decades, its expansion was voracious. They pushed east and south, devouring the lands of Old Kiev and Rus, reaching the Black Sea waters. They became every neighbor's nightmare. They were the shield that stopped the Golden Horde Mongols. They were the sword that kept German knights at bay for 200 years. They were the only nation in Europe that warped thunder and fire while building a state capable of challenging emperors. Sweden never fully recovered its sea dominance. The Teutonic Order never conquered Lithuania's heart. They would finally break their teeth for good at Grunwald a century and a half later, defeated by the descendants of the same men they underestimated on the ice. History began with a routine Viking raid, expecting easy victims. It ended with the birth of Europe's largest state. The wolves of the north learned the lesson too late. You can burn a village, you can tear down a palisade. But if you corner a bear in its own cave, you do not live to tell the tale. In the end, the Baltic was not a Swedish lake, nor a German thief. It was, and always will be, the grave of those who dared underestimate the forest tribes.